A couple of other bits then. Please do just mute your microphones whilst we're doing the presentations. Although actually, I don't think I've heard any rustling yet, so everybody seems to be doing a great job. So we will kind of plan to use the chat function or the raise hand function if you want to chip in at various points throughout the meeting. We do have a comfort break scheduled in the middle, so there will be time just to whiz off and pop to the toilet or get a drink. And just to really highlight that, as you'll see with lots of people coming in, we have quite a diverse group. And, that we will have people here with lived experience. And I'm sure you would all be very sensitive anyway, but do just be mindful, of who might be in the meeting with us today. Okay, so I'm just going to read briefly through our mission statement, which really we kind of pulled together to think about exactly what we want to achieve and what our purpose is as part of ADvaNCE. So we've got this as our statement. Depression, just jumped on. Must be on an automatic timer. It's going to jump on in a second when I'm halfway through, isn't it? Let's see if I can stop it. So depression is a global health challenge with underwhelming treatment outcomes, particularly in young people. Several groups have identified priorities for research in this area. We now need co-development and collaboration to progress this essential work and promote action and change. By bringing together researchers, clinicians, young people and parents, and drawing on existing evidence, we can design solutions that can be readily implemented across settings. So really for us, the aim for ADvaNCE was to take the great work that had already been done around priorities for young people and think about how we take it forwards, and pulling together a great network of individuals to help us to do that. So just a very brief introduction to some of our network planning members. So my name's Faith Orchard. I'm one of the coordinators of the network, and I'm coordinating alongside Victoria Pyle, who's going to chip in a second and say a bit more. We also have, and everyone is here with us today, so we also have Georgia Herring, who is our lived experience researcher. And then our core members include Maria Loades, Shirley Reynolds, Stella Chan and Alex Bullard, all of whom are in the meeting with us. And I think you'll probably get to meet some of those later when we're facilitating the breakout rooms. But actually our network is all about everybody else. It's all about you guys. We're just the ones trying to put it together and get everyone in the same room. So we're really excited to have all of you here with us today. So just to briefly give you a bit of an overview of the types of people that we had signing up. So obviously we're running our meeting now, so we don't have final attendance yet, but this is just a broad overview of the types of roles people noted down when they signed up to the event. So you'll see there's a really nice diverse spread of people working in as practitioners in mental health. We've got researchers, we've got students, postgraduates, PhD students, up to professors, service directors, etc. So a really wonderful, diverse spread of people signing up, and we hope that at the end of the meeting today we'll also have the final list of attendees, so we'll have a nice idea of who we ended up with in our meeting. So I'm going to hand over to Victoria, who's going to just explain a little bit about how the event is going to run today.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. It's really exciting to see you all here today, and as Faith said, it's so important, this network, to us, so thanks for coming. So just to quickly kind of tell you a bit more about our approach. So our focus, as Faith said, is very much on generating testable solutions. We know that several groups have conducted priority setting exercises in this area. So what we wanted to do was kind of take this really good work and try and move it on to get to the next step. So we've identified 3 priorities, and now we hope to begin sort of co-developing solutions and research agendas to these. So this includes both having young people with lived experience as a key part of our core group, but also a survey consulting young people on these priorities, which Georgia will speak much more about in a bit. And then there's these workshops where we hope to kind of brainstorm possible solutions with you, so people from different disciplines and with different experiences. So in terms of the In terms of the priorities, so we started with the James Lind Alliance top 10 priorities for depression and mental health in children and young people. So what we did is we kind of independently rated these in our core group, and we came up with 3. So first of all, about identification, so what methods can be used to identify that a child or young person's mental health is deteriorating. Second, about intervention, so what are the best early interventions for depression. and how early should they be used in order to result in the best patient outcomes. And third, about empowerment. So what are the best ways to inform young people with depression about treatment options and their effectiveness in order to empower them and help them self-manage. So that kind of creates three sort of very strongly related areas in a young person's experience of depression, and these inform our three workshops. So our first workshop today is about identification, our second on the 8th of July is about intervention, and our third on the 15th of September is about empowerment. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, so we'll start with a talk from Dr Joanna Anderson about identifying mental health difficulties in schools. Then Jercia Radez will talk about barriers and facilitators to identification. Georgia will then tell us about the ADvaNCE survey findings on identification. We'll then have a short break, as Faith already mentioned, and then come back for sort of small group discussions in breakout rooms, focusing on this idea of identification. And then finally, we'll all come back together to feedback and have a whole group discussion. So that leads nicely on to me introducing our first speaker. So that's Joanna Anderson, who's a senior research associate and chartered psychologist at Cambridge University. Her current research focuses on early identification of mental health difficulties in children and young people, and on harnessing technology to deliver mental health interventions. So Jo's provided a pre-recorded presentation for today, and then we'll join for our Q&A. So let's get started.
My name is Jo Anderson. I'm a senior research fellow of Cambridge University Department of Psychiatry. And today I will talk about school-based identification of mental health difficulties. First, I want to tell you a little bit more about identification methods that are being used in schools. Universal screening is where all students are assessed using standardized questionnaires that measure different aspects of mental health. The assessment can be either one or multi-gated. So when it's multi-gated, students who score high on the first assessment go on to complete a follow-up questionnaire, usually 2 to 4 weeks later. And if they still score high, they may be offered a full clinical assessment to confirm that they are having some mental health difficulties. Staff in service training is where school staff receives some mental health training. It could be either generic or condition specific to recognize signs of mental health difficulties in pupils and to link them with appropriate support. Curriculum-based models provide students with the knowledge and skills to identify mental health difficulties in themselves, but also in their peers, and then to seek help if needed. And these can be provided through lessons or workshops, sometimes lectures by someone external. Teacher nomination relies on staff noticing any concerning changes in young person's behavior or demeanor and communicating them to school well-being team and sometimes also to parents. This method is the least systematic and does not include any formal training, so staff needs to rely on the knowledge and skills that they already have. We have conducted 2 systematic reviews as well as a study with young people, parents, and with school staff to identify pros and cons for each of those methods. Universal screening seems to be the most accurate one, especially if it is multi-gated. And we know that it's generally quite acceptable to parents and there were no harmful effects shown in studies. However, it can also produce a high rate of false positive results and can be quite resource intensive, which make those programs quite hard to implement in schools. Curriculum-based models are more acceptable to school staff than any other method, and they fit very well with existing curriculum. But they can be seen by staff as quite complex and can be costly to deliver, especially if there is someone external who comes and deliver those. Also, parents consider some topics inappropriate, particularly for younger children. There is some evidence for effectiveness of staff training showing that participation can improve the accuracy of identification. And those methods are generally acceptable to staff and much easier to implement compared to other models, particularly if delivered online. However, if delivered face-to-face, they can be seen as complex, costly, and time-consuming. The staff nomination is very low cost and requires very little additional time, but it's also the least systematic method, and teachers tend to nominate high-risk students with behavioral difficulties, mainly because these are most noticeable and disruptive in a class. But staff often overlooks pupils with internalizing problems like, for example, depression. And we unfortunately don't have enough evidence to draw any conclusion on referrals and uptake of those referrals, as well as cost effectiveness of each model. There are very few studies examining adverse events associated with mental health assessments in school, and these studies found no evidence of harm following screening. In our study, young people, staff, and parents were all concerned about assessments exacerbating young people's anxiety about their mental health, and they were also concerned about bullying and stigma. Parents and staff were worried that schools may become overwhelmed if a high number of students are identified, and raised the issue of long CAMS waiting lists. Young people were particularly concerned about their privacy and confidentiality of their results, and specifically about who in the school can access their results and how it may affect teachers' perception of them. So what do we still need to find out? We need to find out what happens to those identification programs when the study project ends and there is no support from researchers to deliver the program. That's why we need more real-world evaluation to actually identify factors that determine successful implementation and adoption of those programs. We need more studies that strictly verify the identification outcomes by comparing them to gold standards, so to a clinical interview, so we actually can determine how accurate those programs are. We need studies that report referrals and uptake of those referrals to establish the additional need for mental health services. We need to identify core components to see what works and why, and that would add to the flexibility of identification programs, so each school can tailor it to their particular context without sacrificing effectiveness. And finally, we need to find out what broader contextual factors, for example, school culture, are important for implementation and sustainability of those programs. Thank you.
Great, such an interesting presentation, and hopefully a really good summary of everything that we need to start thinking about. Does anyone have any questions? I think we said either hands up or in the chat. Is Jo, I thought Jo might be here.
Yes, I'm here.
Ah, perfect.
Hello. Hi.
Thanks, Jo, that was a great presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Jo? Stella?
Thank you. I just want to help kind of kicking it off as well. It's so interesting. So you mentioned quite a lot of pro and con there. So I'm just kind of wondering, a cheeky question is, what is the next step? Because obviously each of the method have pro and con. So what would be the best, what is the best next step in terms of evaluation or further work?
Well, we are working on developing 2 programs, and actually Emma, who is here, that I've just seen, she is leading on one for primary schools, and her findings are really, really interesting, because that's where parents wanted the combination, and also staff the combination of different approaches, and we have just finished developing an identification for the secondary schools, and this is more a universal screening program, which turned out to be highly acceptable, but the unique thing about it that it's a very rapid assessment using computerized adaptive testing, so it's very much time-saving one, and yeah, in secondary schools everybody's generally happy with universal screening, providing that there is also mental health education, particularly for young people. So this is what we know. And we really, well, in terms of evaluation, we are unfortunately not there yet, but hopefully very, very soon. But I think Emma would be able to speak more to primary school. And her results are very interesting in terms of the combination of different approaches that would be the best from different stakeholders' point of views.
Emma, do you want to say a bit about that, as we're kind of, it's really...
Yeah, happy for that. Sorry, Joe, the reason I was responding in the chat is I didn't think you were here.
I know.
Nice to see you. Yeah, so what Joe is referring to is actually a huge team effort on a study called DEAL, which is developing early identification and access in learning environments. And it's been, sorry, I have a puppy on the loose. It's been about 5 years coming, with lots of the systematic reviews Joe referred to, interviews, surveys, to really figure out what might be the best in terms of effectiveness, acceptability, and feasibility school-based model for identification. And the most recent was a big Delphi survey. So for those of you who don't know, Delphi is about putting out a survey to multiple panels of people, experts in terms of mental health professionals, experts in terms of schools and educators, and experts in terms of parents is what we did. And the preference was for a program that had all three: mental health education, curriculum, teacher training, and universal screening. And so we've put together a model based on what the components were that were preferred by all three of those panels. And we look forward to developing it further and testing it. And I can see many people here who received the survey. So thank you if you filled it out.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other questions for Joe or Emma? We've got a couple in the chat. So any further thoughts on the implications of identification in relation to length of CAMS waiting lists and what happens for children and young people in waiting space once an issue has been, that's a really good question as well, once an issue has been identified? I think that's something we all worry about. Joe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something that we always, we always have this question when we apply for funding. And this is a really tricky one because we can't influence what's happening at CAMS level. We are looking at implementing one of the already developed interventions to support young people who are on waiting lists. So that is one possibility. Also, there are mental health leads now in every school, and according to the quite recent data, I think 70% of secondary schools have a counsellor, but that might not be full-time. So there is always the issue that if we have universal screening as an identification method, we don't really know how many young people in addition we could identify and whether they would be able, the school and CAMS would be able to cope with additional influx. So this is the study that we will hopefully be doing very soon. We would know, that's one of the aims, to evaluate the extra need for mental health support. So we can actually give it a number, how much it increases the need, if any. So, and also we know that early identification actually could be beneficial from the point of view of treatment, because that does not require advanced long treatment if the difficulties are identified early, and they can resolve with a very brief generic interventions quite often. So in the long run, it may actually free up some space in some spaces in CAMS because people wouldn't get that far with their difficulties.
Thanks, Liz. And I think it really also highlights kind of our approach of wanting to think about the whole cycle, and next the workshop 2 as well with this. I think early intervention in schools is a topic very close to lots of our hearts, and trying to generate a number of different options. There's one last question. We'll just do the last question and then we'll move on to Juliet's presentation. So do you have targeted screening based on socioeconomic status or other risk factors?
The intervention, if you're referring to the intervention that we are developing, the universal screening, so that's the Artemis A program, which I think I've put the link in the presentation to it. So this the program is really flexible, so the schools can use it in any way they want to use it. So they can use it as a universal selective screening. So they can basically screen only students that they feel might be at risk for any reason. So yes, so it's very flexible, can be used in any way as the school sees fit.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Jo. That's been so interesting and such an important piece of the puzzle. It's great to have a really brilliant summary to kind of kick us off and thoughts about how to extend that going forward.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm glad that the internet held up here. Thank you.
Yeah. Jo's joining us from her holiday, so we're
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so our next speaker is Jercia, and she completed her PhD at the University of Reading on identifying and overcoming barriers to accessing professional help for anxiety and depressive disorders in adolescents. So she's currently a trainee clinical psychologist at Oxford University, and we're really excited for this presentation as well. So Jercia, you ready to kick off?
Thank you. Right screen. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'll be talking about my PhD research. I was on barriers and facilitators to seeking professional help for adolescent anxiety and depression. So I'll try to focus mainly on depression for the purpose of this presentation. But yeah, just to highlight at the beginning, my PhD was on anxiety and depression, but because these two are so commonly occur at the same time in adolescence, we just kind of did a bit of both. Just a bit of a background. So yeah, depressive disorders in adolescents are one of the most common mental health problems in adolescents, with the estimated prevalence around 5%, although this is quite likely to be much higher for older adolescents and adolescent girls. We know that these problems are significantly interfering with everyday life and are persistent, either not treated. But on the positive note, they're treatable with evidence-based approaches such as CBT. However, they're massively undertreated, and although lots of adolescents with depression report seeking help, most commonly in schools, only a minority access evidence-based treatments such as CBT. So I'll be talking a lot about a paper that we published in European Children's Adolescent Psychiatry. This is just the title, and the link of the paper is below. Feel free to share this, or I can just post it as Emma did in the chat box if anyone's interested. But just briefly what we did and what was my research question, as I mentioned before. So we were wondering, what are the reasons that stop adolescents with anxiety and depression themselves from seeking and accessing professional help? And to our knowledge, this is one of the first studies that actually identified adolescents with anxiety and depression in communities, so in schools, rather than when they already access the services. So, lots of the young people that we worked with haven't sought help before or haven't accessed the services before we identified them. I'm just going to briefly talk through the method. So what we did was that we went into secondary schools in Berkshire, screened 1,200 adolescents with RCADs, MFU, and some help-seeking questions that we developed as a research team. And then we identified lots of adolescents that reported many symptoms on the RCADs and MFU, and then did a diagnostic assessment. So we did ADs and KSATs with 26 adolescents that reported a number of anxiety and depressive symptoms, and then did a qualitative interview study with 22 adolescents who met the criteria for anxiety or depression and went to their parents. And this is the sample that I'm going to be talking about today. So I won't be talking about all 1,200 young people that we have screened, but rather than just 22 that we interviewed. And just to come back to what I was saying before, so I'll try to focus more on depression, but of all 22 young people that we identified as having the disorder, only 5 had MDD as a primary diagnosis, so major depression as a primary diagnosis, and none of them had only depression. So just to keep that in mind, when I'll be talking about like some patterns that we identified in adolescents with depression, just bear that in mind that those young people had anxiety disorders as well. So it's really hard to say, which barriers are more prevalent in adolescents with depression compared to adolescents with anxiety. So these were overall our main findings. So we did a qualitative study and identified 4 themes. We named the first theme Making Sense of Difficulties, and this theme kind of captured adolescents' ability to recognize symptoms and to know that these symptoms are actually symptoms of anxiety and depression, and then knowing where to get help and when to get help, and also adolescents' beliefs and attitudes. So adolescents would often say, oh, I've just been feeling really down, or adolescent boys especially would say, oh, I've just been very irritable and angry lots of the time, but I didn't know that was actually a symptom of a mood disorder. I just thought like, my friends are like that as well, or I just thought it's normal for my age or whatever. I didn't think it was something that requires help or help seeking. And then the second theme we call Disclosing Problems. And that theme was about adolescents' fears and worries about seeking help and disclosing their problems to other people. So just worrying about, what will the teacher think of them, what will parents think of them, what will their friends think of them, and also difficulties with verbalizing their feelings. So like, I knew there was something going on, but I just didn't know how to say it. So, I think that's a really interesting point, because even for adults, it can be hard for us sometimes to like say what's actually going on. We can say, oh, I have a headache or something like that. We are much better in describing our physical sensations rather than saying what's actually going on in our minds. And also things like lack of trust were also reported in this theme. The third theme was very interesting for me personally, because it kind of captured more like the developmental characteristics of adolescents, such as like a strong tendency for being independent and being very self-reliant and showing to other people that you're not a child anymore, but then at the same time kind of acknowledging as well that you still require help from adults and that your help seeking is quite dependent on adults' input. So I think this theme kind of captured this ambivalence that's quite typical for adolescents, I guess. And the final theme captured the instrumental role of others. So importantly, none of the young people that we identified in our study sought help on their own. They always needed either their parents or a GP or a school teacher or someone, or a school counselor, so someone who recognized the symptoms but also facilitated help seeking. And we also identified it's really important that the families know where to go and where to turn to, and that there's like a clear path of seeking help and knowing where to turn to for every family. And also we identified that the role of schools in supporting families is especially important when family resources might be limited. And then just a couple of patterns that we identified that were more specific for adolescents with depression. I just put here a caution sign because, first of all, it's a qualitative study. We didn't do like a statistical t-test when we would compare two groups. So it's, it's more patterns rather than firm conclusions. But we did identify that adolescents with depression reported more difficulties with verbalizing their feelings compared to adolescents with anxiety. And we identified that specific depressive symptoms such as hopelessness and helplessness can get in the way of help seeking. And also what we found was quite interesting, we had lots of chats about this with Faith, I remember, because we identified lots of adolescent boys with depression, which is a age group and gender group that is hugely underrepresented in services in CAMHS, at least based on my experience. And it seems to me like that interventions like screening are really good in picking up that group of young people. So adolescent boys who are often they often think that they're just being, grumpy and irritated, but actually, they're struggling with depression or other mood difficulties. And just briefly, a few take-home messages based on our study. So first of all, we kind of need to improve mental health literacy of adolescents and connected adults, and that includes families, GPs, school workers. Adolescents in our study actually really liked, just going back to Joe's presentation, really liked the screening. They felt it was a good way of like independent people coming into school and picking up the students that are struggling and then, you know, talking with them and trying to help them. So I think like screening can be actually an intervention that not only improves identification, but also improves knowledge of people. Then normalizing mental health problems and reducing stigma. Yeah, that's, you know, unfortunately still a big one. And events like this one today, I think, are very helpful in kind of just talking about it and thinking about what we can change. Adolescents also said that they would really want to kind of have more partnership approach, so not be feeling patronized by mental health professionals, and yeah, just to be included like as a kind of more equivalent member when working with like professionals, and just like knowing that their voices are being heard essentially. And we need to support families, especially when there's resources are limited. So that's especially, you know, comes down to schools that, you know, they identify adolescents that might come from more challenging backgrounds, and like just make sure that their families are supported as well. So, you know, we don't kind of miss out on those young people. And finally, yeah, just maybe an obvious point, but still a huge problem, I think, not just in the UK, but everywhere in the world, that, you know, the services are not widely accessible, and long waiting lists often prevent people from accessing help. So yeah, just need to kind of be loud about this and make services as accessible as possible. So thank you very much for this, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this presentation. It's nice to talk about the PhD after it's been a while.
Thanks so much, Jercia. That was absolutely brilliant, and really nicely followed on from what Jo was talking about as well, hearing some of those perceptions that came out from young people in the interviews. So we're just going to do another little short Q&A. So there's a question already in the chat from Stella. I'll read out Jercia for you. It says, one of my MSc students examined adolescents' attitudes about depression on an online forum and found quite a lot of hostility towards those who are perceived as faking depression. They're not actually faking, but considered as not serious enough, leading to accusing these adolescents as attention seeking, similar to the misunderstanding and stigma around self-harm. Some adolescents also self-doubt, which then hinder their willingness to seek help. Wondering if your study has observed similar faking depression issues.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Stella. So I remember interviewing a couple of adolescent boys with depression, and they said exactly the same. I didn't want to be perceived as a person, as an attention seeker, and didn't want to be a burden, or I think it's kind of all interrelated. It's kind of highlighting the stigmatizing attitudes, and then self-stigma as well. You know, we know that stigma has like obviously different levels, and they think that they are being attention seekers, that also going to stop them from seeking help. I think that forums can be quite, a hostile environment as well. So, I did definitely come across those things. Yeah, thank you.
And we got a couple of questions on the idea of the mental health literacy. So the first one is, are you familiar with how mental health literacy can be assessed? And then the second one is whether you think it would be more appropriate to target the literacy at the young people, or... sorry, George, I'm misreading your question. So regarding mental health literacy, do you think it would be more helpful to target literacy at adolescents, or do we think it needs to be targeted at a younger age?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of how literacy could be assessed, I didn't work on this particular subject in my PhD, but now in my clinical training and my essentially new PhD that I'm doing now as a part of my clinical course, we will be working with adolescents again, but we'll be identifying like some more, not stuff related to anxiety and depression, but more psychosis and early intervention psychosis. And we will just create probably some measures that will be asking young people about, do you know where you would seek help if you would be experiencing this and that? Or do you know what are the most common symptoms of this and that? Or do you know if you're feeling this and this and that, what does that mean? Does that mean you're crazy, or does that mean that you're struggling? So, I think that's yeah, I'm not aware of like many mental health literacy tools, but I'm sure they exist because there are like so many tools for everything these days. To be honest, it's probably like too many of them. I would imagine they're quite specific for like specific disorders rather than like being the generic mental health literacy tool, but I might be wrong. So yeah. Oh, so Maria has just, thank you, posted something as a review of
and Jercia, then just that question about whether we think we should be targeting adolescents or whether it needs to be targeted at a younger age.
That's a really good question. Yeah, so I think that mental health literacy, I'm not sure, but I've been speaking with other people about stigma and, you know, I guess knowledge and stigma, all those things are quite connected, aren't they? And I've been speaking to some people and they were saying, well, actually, you know, stigmatizing beliefs and attitudes develop when young people are of age 5 or 6 or something like that. So then it would make more sense to do these interventions in primary school rather than in secondary school. I don't know. I think that, you know, it would be good, obviously, to start as soon as possible, and then just rather than saying, oh, we did that in primary school and that was it, rather just have like sort of continuity and maybe, you know, do some lessons in primary school and then do them again in like year 8 and year 9, just to have some sort of like, yeah, as I said, continuity rather than just one-time point things. Because, you know, we know that those attitudes and beliefs and everything, they develop in a primary family context as well. And young people spend most of the time with their, you know, at home with their parents and families. So if we want an intervention on stigma and beliefs and literacy to have actual effect, has to be longer than just one 45-minute session, I think. So yeah, start as early as possible and continue.
Lovely. I think that's a good note to end our Q&A on as well. Thanks so much, Jercia. That was absolutely fantastic. There are just a couple of follow-up comments and questions in the chat, Jercia. So I wonder if you're able to just pick up on those in the message, and then we're going to move on to the next presentation. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a fantastic talk, Jercia. That was great, really interesting. And we're going to kind of nicely follow on, actually. I feel like it's almost like we planned it. These talks are really nicely transitioning. So we've got Georgia Herring next, who is our lived experience research assistant as part of our ADvaNCE network. And Georgia's going to be talking about the findings from the survey that we've done with young people to get their views on some of these topics that we're discussing. Do you want to share your screen, Georgia? You're muted, Georgia, just in case you're trying to talk to us.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Georgia. So just, that's it. Brilliant. So we got it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Georgia Herring, and I'm part of the ADvaNCE group. So as Faith said, my role is as a lived experience researcher. So this means I've been supporting the team in planning and running the workshops, and I offer a lived experience perspective just to make sure that the work we do is meaningful and engaging to young people. So today I'll be talking through our young people survey and the perspectives young people have shared regarding how we can better identify depression in young people. So young people's perspectives are really, really important in order to guide research directions in a meaningful and helpful way, and ultimately improve how we identify depression in young people. To gain young people's perspectives, we created the Young People's Have Your Say survey. We contacted young people's advisory groups who distributed the survey to young people aged 16 to 24 to complete on a voluntary basis. The survey focuses on barriers and methods of identifying depression in young people, particularly parental and school-based methods. And we've been able to collect both quantitative and qualitative perspectives from this survey. For those of you who might not be familiar with this terminology, this means we were able to gather numerical and written information. So when we asked young people why they thought it might be hard to identify depression in young people, the most frequently selected answer, as you can see in the longest blue bar on the graph, is that people might mistake a young person's behaviour when experiencing depression or low mood as being grumpy, quieter, or a typical teenager. The second most frequent response, as you can see directly below that, was that negative beliefs from friends, family and society can make it difficult for young people to tell others that they're experiencing depression or low mood. These are some responses from young people when they were asked, why do you think it might be hard to identify depression in young people? One young person expressed that a lot of people tend to view depression as a taboo, and if someone has it, they will just take up another person's time. So I believe stereotypes play a huge role. I think it is often mislabeled as general stress or changes in hormones that affects everyone, especially by parents and schools. From what I've seen, help is usually only given once it gets really serious. There is also still a lot of stigma around it, as people don't want to seem weak or attention-seeking, especially among young men. Young people may not know how to express their feelings or who to express them to. When we asked young people what they thought could help parents recognise depression in young people, the options which young people expressed as being very helpful, as illustrated by the green bars, were that making sure that schools and clubs communicate with parents about their teenagers' well-being regularly, providing parents with more information about depression, and encouraging parents to talk to their child or teenager about their mental health. As you can see in the green and blue bars, which green stands for very helpful and blue for helpful, all these options were rated as being more helpful than they were unhelpful. However, some options, such as encouraging parents to talk to professionals about their child's mental health, received the highest very unhelpful rating, which is shown by the long red bar on the screen. These are some quotes from young people when they were asked, what do you think could help parents recognise that a young person is experiencing depression or low mood? One young person suggested maybe hosting seminar type events in local areas to teach and engage parents on how to notice and properly deal with depression. Another young person suggested, I think also trying to normalise it in general society as well. Many parents have felt similar things in the past, but never acknowledged it as depression, so therefore think it's normal for their child as well. Educating everyone makes it natural for parents to be aware of. When asked to select helpful school-based methods for identifying depression in young people most frequently selected the following options as being very helpful, as illustrated in green. These very helpful options were links between mental health services and schools, being able to visit a mental health professional at school, and mental health training for teachers, both before and after qualifying. These are some responses from young people regarding school-based methods and barriers of identification. One young person expressed, it's kind of scary to let anyone else know that you feel a way about yourself and life. My teachers didn't believe I actually had mental health problems till I got a letter from my doctor. Young people don't really know what they are feeling is depression, as it is put, that it is normal for teenagers to have mood swings. I think it is difficult for young people to acknowledge it in themselves and reach out because talking to teachers is daunting in itself, so many don't bother. Abundance of schoolwork, becoming so busy that they can't find the time to take care of themselves. These responses are from young people when they were asked, what do you think can make it difficult for young people with depression or low mood to get support? Young people expressed not being taken seriously by their school or GP when expressing their feelings, or getting it downplayed by professionals due to the young person's age. Not knowing they suffer from depression. They don't know how or do not feel safe enough to bear all to another person. Not feeling worthy of the help or a chance to feel better. And lastly, stigma around mental health, lack of free time to address issues, not knowing how to approach people for help. Ooh. We are now moving on to the discussion section of today's workshop. We'll be going into breakout rooms shortly. Each breakout room will have an advanced group member coordinating the discussion. So in your groups, we'd like you to discuss, based on the talks today, what changes could be made in the way that we identify depression or low mood in young people. We'd like you to generate 2 solutions or 2 suggestions for how we might take this work forward. Once we're in the breakout rooms, we'll be pulled back into the main room at 10:40, so 20 to 11, and that's when our advanced group coordinators will bring forward the suggestions that each breakout room has generated. But before we move on to the discussion part, if we'd like to take a 5-minute comfort break, and then when you return, you should be placed into your breakout room.